talk about brains. There's some psychology in here. There's some neuroscience stuff in here. As I've been reading about how brains work and then applying it to my design work, the thing that I think I've realized about what makes it important to designers is that we manage attention. And attention equals value. It is the only truly finite resource in the world. So for the purposes of our discussion, we're going to define attention as cognitive resources devoted over time. And the colors aren't super bright, but this slide is orange, and there's a reason for that. Because orange is the color that nature uses to tell us to pay attention. If you think about animals that can mess you up, like poison dart frogs and coral snakes and that kind of stuff, they're all orange. We, as a species, have adapted all of these great techniques for getting our own attention, like road cones and that kind of stuff, and they're orange. So orange is a harbinger of attention. So attention equals value. So what's that really mean is it's the only thing we can really get together that's worth anything in the face of changing resources and changing business landscapes and that kind of stuff, which is why, say, athletes make so much freaking money, even though what they do is relatively meaningless. They have the ability to aggregate our attention, right? The fact that you can get 60,000 people into the same place to pay attention to the same thing for 3 hours is a really, really valuable thing, and advertisers are willing to pay for that attention. It's kind of the foundation of our whole economy, because it's also why we pay actors so much, or if you prefer, actresses. And the reason that attention is so valuable is that, like I said, attention is finite. I would explain it, but because you are going to die, right? You have a limited amount of time on this earth. There's a limited number of CPU cycles you can devote to anything, right? And so over that finite period of time, you can't make more. And the value of anything is derived from its availability and demand for it. One of the things that we need to remember as designers is that attention is a byproduct of an organ in our bodies, right? It's a physical system, and it's it's an economy, really, right? We're talking about the devotion of nutritional resources because we think of thoughts as being a sort of ethereal thing that comes and goes, but the reality is that thoughts are really nutritionally expensive, right? Your brain uses up 20% of the calories that your whole body uses, while only taking up 2.5% of your weight. So it's a hugely disproportionate user of energy. And because of that, we are kind of conservative about it. Like we don't want to waste more of it than we need to. But literally, in terms of nutrition, attention is expensive, right? So I always tell people that wasting someone's time and attention is the same as smacking a sandwich out of their mouth. Because nutrition is fungible. Nutrition not spent is the same as nutrition, taken in. So as a designer, we try to be respectful of that, right? Don't require more attention of things than they need in order to get stuff done if you're designing an interface or something like that, which brings me to my next point. Oh, that color is perfect on my screen. Facebook, right? Everybody complains about the amount of attention that is required to navigate Facebook every time they redesign the damn thing, right? It's not that the new design is bad. I looked at a timeline of Facebook redesigns while I was preparing for this, and aside from the fact that nobody is used to timeline yet, like if you look at these redesigns, it gets better every time, and everyone bitches about it endlessly for like a month after every single one. And it's not that the design is worse. If the design is worse, they could put it back and we'd all be happy. But when they change it again, we complain that they changed it again. So obviously you get used to it. It's really, we complain because we're required to put forth extra effort to learn how to use the stupid thing. All right, so there's some really cool stuff having to do with our brains and attention and how it works and how it creates opportunities for designers. The first one is we can be respectful and conserve attention since it is so expensive, right? One of the other cool factors to think about is how inefficient it is, right? There are 40 quadrillion neurons in your brain. That's what I mean by it's inefficient. It takes a tremendous mechanism to make all this stuff work. If this is the internet, the entire internet, this times 100,000 is your brain. Or, oh, you can't even see it. That very first dot, right? That's the whole internet. That's every device connected to the internet. All of the rest of these times 100. So 100 of those screens are the number of connections in your brain. It's the number of nodes in your brain. So it takes a ton of connections to create the thoughts that we have, right? I was thinking about it the other day as I was preparing this, and I was like, you know, it kind of is like the saying, if you had an infinite number of monkeys banging on an infinite number of typewriters, they would eventually spit out Hamlet, right? That's kind of what our brain is. It's an infinite number of monkeys on an infinite number of typewriters. And it's kind of amazing because it creates human thought in the process. And that's really, really rad. So it's massively inefficient. There's huge mechanisms involved. Hang on to that thought for a second. The next cool thing is that we never lose primitive functions. Our brains work like an ice cream cone. We just stack stuff on top, right? So you start with a jellyfish, meaning that you have very basic, kind of functions, the kind of stuff that is involuntary, right? Then you got lizard, very instinctive, mouse, primate, human, like we just stack more stuff. So the cool thing is, by the time you get to human, we're capable of having really, really complex thought. We're capable of designing systems and that kind of stuff. But this stuff still exists. It's still in there somewhere, right? And because it was never conscious, like a jellyfish doesn't have consciousness, we as designers can use this. Like it's always there, even if we don't necessarily know how to get to the human part. People can use the human part to rationalize things. They can't get around, really any of these first three. We can exploit. Exploit's maybe not the word, but we can use them to accomplish our goals. So those flaws represent opportunities. Okay. Evolutionarily, that means that it takes forever to wire up those 40 quadrillion things, right? And because of that, we have a need for an extended adolescence, which means we need 20 years of living with our families. And that doesn't work unless you develop a mechanism to be able to stand those people. So we developed love. And that familial love also turned into a very similar emotion as you are forming attachments to people you'll go off and form your family with as you grow up and stuff. So because we need those things in order to get our children to adulthood and push them out of the nest, we develop these emotions, which then as designers, we use, right? We can create the things that, like Milton Glaser says, inform and delight because we have delight, because we evolved love, because it takes so freaking long to wire 40 quadrillion network nodes. Yeah, that's staggering to me. That's why we have these things. The other thing is that because it takes so many neurons to make decisions, to process visual stimuli, all that stuff, we make a lot of mistakes. And optical illusions are always my favorite example of this, right? You don't believe me, or you're not going to believe me when I say it, but square A and square B are the exact same shade of gray. Your brain, as a shortcut to trying to perceive reality, tells you that A is darker. But it's wrong. It's really wrong. I mean, they're exactly the same shade. But because your brain jumps to these cognitive conclusions where it says, oh, well, this is farther in the background, or it's that the pattern is light and dark, and that one's a dark square and this one's a light square, it tells you what color they are before it's actually done perceiving all that information. And it makes mistakes all the time. I mean, that's, M.C. Escher made a career out of it, right? That's how all optical illusions work. Your brain tries to make a decision, and it gets it wrong. That's really awesome, because since we know the brain's going to rush to conclusions, we as designers can use that to our advantage. I like to talk about it in terms of logo design because there's not very many moving parts, right? So, one of the things people say is, keep it simple, stupid, right? I prefer keep it cognitively efficient, stupid. Because that's what logo design is about. And you look at the Nike logo as an example, this is greater than that, because this is how reading works, right? When you read, you have to recognize a letter, and then you recognize the next one. And your brain pairs down the possible, combinations of, what might be coming after that, and what the sounds might be, and, all that stuff. And then you add another one, and it keeps going with this sort of logical leaping, right? And so what it's really doing is eliminating possibilities more than it is actually reading. It's not assembling so much as it's assuming what the end will be and paring down the choices. So then when you get the end of the word, it does this really cool thing called a saccade, where it loops back and makes sure that oh, this is the end of the word, so this is the whole thing, and that's what the word is, right? It does the same thing when you're reading a line of type, which is the real reason that you're never supposed to have a line of type that only has one word on it is because it messes up your brain. It's not because it looks ugly or because your typesetter's going to wrap your knuckles or whatever. Or your art director, or whomever is going to wrap your knuckles is going to wrap your knuckles. It's because when you get to the end of a sentence, your brain loops back to the beginning and makes sure that you got the whole context right. And so if you have the last word of a sentence as the only thing on a line, there's nowhere to loop back to. And your brain gets mad at you. So, or actually, your brain gets mad at whoever set the type. So that's my whole goal as a designer. Don't let people get mad at me. So then the way it works is that eventually we've read this word enough that we start to recognize it as a solid object, right? It's no longer an N, an I, a K, and an E. It's the word Nike, right? Which, if you think about it, is great, considering the fact that I know I mispronounced that word when I was learning how to read, right? Because that's not Nike. I'm not Greek, so it's not Nike. Yeah, so eventually it becomes a shorthand, sort of like the optical illusion that we looked at, where your brain starts leaping to these decisions, right? So the structural problem with using this over, say, a proper logo is that all you have to do is change the font, and it really, really changes. It takes you an extra split second to assemble that information into whatever it's supposed to mean, right? One of the great things about the Nike logo is that it is brilliantly efficient, right? So, yeah, a symbol is more efficient than a word, even a short one. And furthermore, there's something to be said for the simplicity of this specific logo, because it only takes 4 pieces of information to build it. And your brain works by building information off of as little, or building visuals off of as little information as possible. So you can obscure part of this, and you get this arc correct, or you see this long tail or whatever, and you will assume it's the Nike logo because you've seen the Nike logo frequently enough that it'll do it. The Nike logo is so brilliantly efficient that you can see it full speed on an Olympic class athlete's foot in motion and still parse it. And that's freaking brilliant, right? It's because if you see a logo and your brain doesn't get the whole thing, it doesn't count. It doesn't make an impression. And every time you make an impression in your brain, your brain uses this stuff called myelin that's mostly made out of cholesterol, which is one of the reasons that your brain really likes bacon. And it insulates the pathway that goes from your visual center to the neocortex, where you're storing all your thoughts about athletic apparel. So Nike, by having a super efficient logo, make sure that every single time you see it, even if it's for a thousandth of a second, it gets all the way home, every single time. This is a still from a TV ad. It's a little dark, so it's hard to see. But this ad isn't for the New York Yankees and it isn't for Nike. But the Nike logo shows up in it so many times. The first time I saw it, I was kind of watching TV while I was like tapping away on my laptop and just kind of glancing up. I had no idea what this was for until the very last second of the ad when the guy walks up to a Pepsi Max machine. That's what's so freaking brilliant about the Nike logo, is that just glancing up or having it in my peripheral vision, I could still register the Nike logo like 100 times in 30 seconds. I had no idea it was about Pepsi. I've gone back and watched this ad to grab this still, and the Pepsi logo shows up a bunch of times before the end. It's just never long enough that I noticed it when it was in my peripheral vision. Whereas this, I totally parsed in my peripheral vision. That's a really astounding thing. They totally hijack the Pepsi commercial, and they hijack every Major League Baseball game because all the Major League Baseball teams have to have the same apparel deal where they have to wear the Nike mock turtlenecks. So yeah, Nike gets a ton of impressions out of that. So the brilliant thing about the Nike logo is that it's so efficient. I said this a couple weeks ago for the first time, so I hope it's still funny. But the Nike logo is a cigarette boat moving at full speed with the lights off, smuggling branding messages into your neocortex under the cover of night. Right? It's fast, and you just don't even know that it happened. It's so insanely brilliant. But visual efficiency isn't the only way for a logo to work. In fact, I would say if it were, then the best logos in the world would all be a circle or a square or a triangle or the things you could build with the fewest points. And that's certainly not true. I'm not going to go through like a whole thing of all the different ways you can build mnemonic value into logo designs, but one of my favorite is pictograms, right? Because I can totally read that. No one needs any help with that, right? I have a 3-year-old, and when he was about 2.5, he started pointing to the logo on my monitor or on my iMac or whatever and saying Apple. And that makes all the sense in the world, right? It's super easy to parse. It's almost to the Nike point where like you just have to see it. And Apple spends a lot of their advertising money on product placement on TV shows, and that's exactly why, because that sucker gets home fast, right? But it is the word, right? So there are tons of great examples of companies with pictographic logos, but they're never pictographs of what they sell. Like those aren't the really effective ones. Pictographs of the name are what work. So it's Shell, it's Jaguar, it's Apple, right? It does the work for you in terms of replacing the word. If you did the same thing with the Nike logo, it wouldn't be nearly as easy because I wear swoosh athletic shoes or whatever. Like it just doesn't make as much sense. Whereas that makes all the sense in the world. So that's just one way to build mnemonic value, but that's one of the other ways to make a design effective is you make it super efficient, but then you also build memorable things into it because we do kind of seek out memorable things. It's a trick that our brain uses to decide what's important. And we search really hard for patterns. Humans will put together basically anything with 2 dots and a line as a face, right? And that's an evolutionary holdover from a time when we were still part of the food chain and like things with eyes might eat us. But because of that, that's why like dogs don't care about cartoons of dogs, right? Like they don't look like dogs. But we will put anything together into a face if we can, which as designers we can use to our advantage, and people do all the time. A pretty benign example is emoticons, right? So there's this part of your brain that's devoted to seeking out patterns and determining what's important, because the way we build images in our brain is not the way a TV works, right? It doesn't go linearly. It doesn't start at the top and go to the bottom and build, line by line. It kind of starts with this like crazy, fuzzy, black and white, low def thing. And there's a 50 millisecond lag before you get color or you start to see definition. And in that 50 milliseconds, your brain tries to decide what's important, right? It tries to decide what might eat you. And so one of the cool ways that people use this device is to build in false dimensionality, right? This logo kills me. I love the old UPS logo dearly. There was a, I'm sorry to smack the microphone. I used to do this thing with my UPS guy where I would, whenever I was going to be out and he was going to be bringing me something, I would like draw the UPS logo on my note, like, dear UPS guy, right? So, I mean, I've drawn that logo like 100 times, and it's, yeah, it saddened me when they got rid of it. But legitimately, this one draws your attention more on the back of the truck, because that 50 millisecond system, which is kind of on high alert when you're driving because everything's moving really fast, sees this gradation that might represent dimensionality and kind of freaks out. Like it might eat you. It might be not on that truck, but behind the truck. And that's, so it means that, that the resolution around this image resolves first, right? So it resolves at the same time as the other cars, as opposed to like a flat graphic that was on one of the cars. So marginally faster than if you had a FedEx truck sitting next to it. Right? Going back to the complexity for a second. The complexity of the wiring and all the 40 quadrillion parts, right? One of the cooler things about the human experience, because that's where metaphor comes from, especially for us as designers, the thing that makes our brains different from, say, an engineer's brain is that our brains are less well insulated, right? So we're slightly less good at linear tasks where you have to do a lot of steps in sequence, right? It also means that we are less good at having linear thoughts, where we will think through, like, say, building a flow diagram for something, or remembering what order you're supposed to add, or do your algebra. I could never remember the order of operations for algebra. I somehow made it through calculus, not knowing the order of operations for calculus or for algebra. But because of that, so what's happening is, because our brain is less well insulated, we get all these electrical impulses that collide with each other, right? And so we have intrusive thoughts. I read this really, really cool book called The Creating Brain, right? And this lady went through all these case studies of famously creative people. My favorite one was Mozart. He suffered from incredibly intrusive thoughts, to the point where, like, there's this whole thing in there that he wrote about how he was having a conversation with someone riding in a carriage, and basically an entire musical composition came to him like a daydream, totally derailed the conversation. He totally ignored this person for like however long it took to play this thing in his head, and then came out of it and was like, I'm sorry, whatever, I was just distracted. And then went and wrote this thing, and it was awesome. And I think that's the way a lot of it, like, of course, as I'm reading that, I was on an airplane, I was reading it, and I had an intrusive thought about intrusive thoughts while I was reading about the intrusive thought. And I was like, oh, that is how it works, isn't it? Because I just had this really crazy idea about how attention works while I was reading about Mozart's attention deficit disorder. So I don't know if anybody else suffers from that. Maybe it's just me and Mozart, but I get T-boned by thoughts all the time. So yeah, and part of that collision is what allows us to see two things that are not the same and say they are the same, like metaphors and car crashes, or Nike logos and cigarette boats. They're not the same, but that's how metaphor works. We say these are the same thing, and that's what makes us great as designers. We have to look at this, two things that are seemingly not the same and say this is how they could be the same, if we think about them in this way. And I really do think that's the root of everything that we do. There's an interesting. All right, I'm going to switch gears for a second. One of my big ideas about design is that it's our job to preserve people's attention as a natural resource, right? Because really, you could use it to measure people's lives, right? And the time that we ask of them that we don't need to, this waste that we create, like, they're never getting that back, right? And this is an idea that I've had for a while, but then I was reading the Steve Jobs biography, and there's a story about the original Macintosh team. And Steve Jobs came to them and said, I want you to cut out 10 seconds. Every time it boots, we need to save 10 seconds. They're like, oh, it can't be done. The thing boots, really, seriously, dude, it boots as fast as it's ever going to boot. And they argued about it for a while, and the next day he came back and said, could you get it to boot 10 seconds faster if it would save someone's life? Like, well, I mean, okay, whatever. Like, for the sake of argument, sure. So, okay. If you make the assumption that everyone's going to boot up their computer once a day, right? And it saves 10 seconds. So that's, you multiply that by what they expected their user base would be, which is 5 million users. That's, yeah, that's that. It's a big number. It's, what, 18.25 billion. So divide that by an average of 2.5 billion seconds per lifetime. You save about 7 1/3 lifetimes per year just by saving 10 seconds. The interesting thing to me, as I was reviewing Facebook and that kind of stuff, and I don't know if everybody here is a real super savvy Facebook user, and I'm not. I can never figure out how the hell to send one of my friends a message on Facebook. I easily spend 10 seconds looking for it before I give up. And then I just go call them on my phone or send them an email or whatever, right? I just find another way to get in touch with them. Because they bury it in some weird place. I don't know. There's 750 million people using Facebook. Half of them use it actively. And if you save every single one of them, not even 10 seconds, but a second every day by improving that interface design, this is a much, much larger number. So I guess the pessimistic way to say it would be bad design kills, but the better way to put it is good design saves lives. So I'm going to leave you with that. We're all designers, we all make stuff, and we're all responsible for managing the attention of the people that we share the planet with. So to paraphrase a comic book, like always, with great power comes great responsibility. So design responsibly. That's it. Got any questions? There are a couple of books I want to recommend. And I wanted to go over more of this stuff, but I didn't get a chance to make notes on it. Oh, there it is. Okay, this is a great book. 100 Things Every Designer Should Know About People. It's written by a lady who's a PhD in psychology and then became a web designer. She also wrote a book called Neuro Web Design. I haven't read that one. It's a little dense, comparatively. This one is just a list of 100 things about things like how people read and how people process stuff and how much it costs in terms of attention to like click on things versus remember things. So in terms of website interfaces, like it's 10 times more costly to remember where something is than it is to click more than once. So the whole 3-click rule, maybe not as important as you can click lots of times if it's really obvious where you should be clicking. Yeah, really fascinating book. And I started off like putting little Post-its in every time I found something that was like a super nugget, and then I was just like, I think I'm up to point 25, and I've got 25 Post-it notes in here, so I'm going to stop. So there's also, I don't know if anyone has, it's Susan M. Weinschenk. It's Weinschenk. Does anybody listen to Radiolab? It's good stuff. There's a show from Radiolab's podcast, everybody should go download it, called Choice, that they put out in November of 2008, that talks about how we make decisions. And it's a crazy process. Like, and it's really not devised to help you make better decisions at all. Like, that's not how it works. All you do is eliminate choices, right? So and the thing is, like, we think of like, oh, there's rational decisions and there's emotional decisions, but the reality is that almost all of the decisions we make are emotional decisions, because if you tried to make them purely rational, there's really no difference between all the alternatives. Like, there's no good reason to use a blue pen over a black pen. So you just go with it. So there's a really interesting story on that episode about a guy who had like a tumor or a brain injury or something and lost his emotions and stopped being able to pick cereal, pick a pen. He ended up getting divorced and went broke because he also lost the ability to determine when someone was lying to him. So he like fell in with a bunch of con men, and there's all this really awesome stuff that our brain does kind of behind the scenes that we don't realize that is just fantastic. And it's I personally have this theory that all of it is incredible shorthand for really, really complicated math, right? And as an example of this, I always use my mother-in-law, who is a realtor and has been for like 30 years. And she can look at a house and, you know, a set of like market statistics and tell you exactly how much it will sell for in how much time. Like you can say, oh, if I need to get ready your house in 30 days, I'll price it like this, it will sell in 30 days, right? But she's also the person who would tell you she is terrible at math. She's like, oh, math, I'm terrible at math. I don't even do it. No, you do really, really complicated math. Like, math is so complicated that if someone could figure out how to delineate it, they would write a program to do it, and we would all sell our houses in exactly the right time. Like, they would just integrate it into a tool, and every realtor would be able to do that. She's scary good at it. And it's just kind of a, you know, it's a gut. That's what we all call our gut. It's really, really complicated math that our brains have developed this really incredible shorthand for. And it's going way back, it's one of these tools that our brain came up with to deal with the massive inefficiency of our brains, right? If it would take a ton of cognitive resources and you'd have to do like 4,000 steps of arithmetic, your brain will just go, I feel like it should be this. It's done all the math, but it's not gonna like tell you the arithmetic because that would be incredibly wasteful. It's the same thing with why we seek patterns and that kind of stuff, and why we, like the guy who fell in with the con men, there's this thing that we do subconsciously where we figure out if people are lying to us. It's this thing called micro-expressions. It's our brain only pays attention to the information it absolutely needs, which means that it pays no attention to like 99.5% of the body language that we use with each other. It just pays attention when it sees like the little point that it needs to go, oh, that guy's lying to me. That's it. Has anybody read Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, right? They talk about this guy who reviewed thousands and thousands of hours of videotape of married couples talking to one another, and he figured out a way that he can tell in like 15 minutes if their marriage is going to last more than 15 years. And the only thing he looks for is contempt. Like if one of the spouses ever makes this one tiny micro expression, he can go, they're done. And he's like really scary accurate. And that's the thing, like he's codified this thing that we all kind of know. Like we all know couples that like you just know it's not going to last or whatever. And that's what it is. Like you identified a thing that is important about relationships and you can just be with them and get it. He took the thousands of hours that it took to like actually catalog and the thousands of hours and lots of manpower and money that it took to catalog all this video and isolate the micro expressions and then look at the statistics and say, okay, the only thing that matters is this one micro expression, and then you can predict them. But that's how our brain works all the time. Yeah?
I would just have one point of interest, and then the second one would be a kind of a question.
Sure.
One of the things that because you were talking about the emotional connection between visual input and the emotional visceral reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And I watched a documentary. I don't read. I watched a documentary.
I listen to audiobooks.
And it was talking about the fact that your occipital pathway goes through your limbic system before it hits your cognitive upper cerebral cortex. You know, and there was an individual who had damaged that portion of it.
Yeah.
He would look at his mother and be like, that's not my mother.
Right.
So you form a visceral reaction to something before you actually understand what it is. And I found that was extremely interesting, especially in design, where you can present a really good message, but if it's presented in a bad way, the person's automatically going to have a visceral negative experience. Then the second one was, we're talking about saving people's lives. I don't know what kind of clients you have, but the kind of clients I have, they don't really care as much about people's lives as about how much money they're making.
There's an argument to be made that it's the same thing, but
well,
yeah.
Like you were talking about Facebook and how Facebook, has these issues with complexity of the user interface, and it's because a lot of times, and I've had several large websites back in the past, where they would actually build in hurdles.
Right, they're trying to increase their page views or...
Right, to increase page views, to increase time on their site, and user experience has a tendency to go out the window because people are like, if you come to them and say, oh, they'll be off your site faster, and they're like, what?
No, we want them on the site longer.
We want them to stay on the site forever.
Yeah, and we want them to be on more pages on our site for more time.
But they'll lose their jobs. We don't care.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, how do you kind of bridge? Like, I've tried to explain it, to where it's like, okay, if you put your brand on it and they have a bad experience, then they're associating your brand. It's causing that linkage in their little brains.
That's exactly how I explain it to people. Actually, that's.
Now you don't know what you're talking about.
That's bad clients. Don't work with them. Yeah, I have kind of a cavalier attitude towards it.
You've approached that conversation with clients to be like, this is not such a good idea.
Yeah, that specific example, I'll be honest, I don't have a ton of experience with. Like, I've not done a lot of publishing sites where their goal is to drive page count up. And typically because the work that I've done has been either nonprofit stuff where they're trying to give people information and not necessarily, they don't care about page count. They care more about time on site than they care about page count. Or it's been branding stuff where the branding experience is absolutely the paramount thing. So it's very easy for me to explain, like, listen, if you make this crappy, your name is on it, and they're gonna associate those things. I can think of a dozen websites that I do not visit anymore because they've got those stupid pagination things on there. So I just read their RSS feed. I don't ever go to their site because their site treats me badly. I also think that's like kind of taking that one step further. I think that's one of the great things about tools like Flipboard, right? Is that they allow you to be like super efficient with your cognition. Like you can just do all of your RSS feeds and all this stuff through Flipboard, and you get this nice layout. It's a very natural reading thing. You never have to even go to their site if you don't want to. Or you can do an even better thing I was telling my friend Jimmy about last night. You can make a Twitter feed of all the people who retweet all the stuff that you actually are interested in reading. So then instead of subscribing to RSS feeds, you subscribe to their Twitter feed, and then they only retweet the stuff that you care about. Like, I don't care about 2/3 of the stuff that Gizmodo puts out, but I have a couple of friends who read Gizmodo for me and only tweet out the stuff that I would care about, and so then you just read that. I think that that's, guys like people who made Flipboard like understand that people are trying to optimize their attention and, make a tool that makes that possible. Yeah, it's an interesting point.
It's usually a conversation.
Yes. Is
Painful
this really, and that's, what's funny about clients though is that I end up having that similar conversation, maybe not that exact conversation, about just about anything. I've got a client who sells shaving cream, and they sell it through their website, and they also sell it through Amazon.com. And the product is fulfilled through Amazon.com, and it is way cheaper for them when someone buys it on Amazon.com than when they buy it through their website. And so my position is, why are we promoting the website? Like, if we have to pay to promote the website and then it costs you an extra $1.65 when you sell something on the website, maybe don't promote the website. Promote the thing on Amazon.com, and then, every 10 of them you sold, you've made an extra $16.50. Like, that's, so yeah, I try to break it down in economics. That's one of the things that I think about in terms of brains. Like I said, it's a physical system. It's a nutrition or whatever. It's an economic system. It's about balance. It's about like risk reward. It's about resources versus things you can accomplish, right? So that's how I think about brains all the time.
I also think it's interesting. One of the things that people don't realize is that when you're talking about interactive design, you're actually, the brain is in a completely different state than if they're having a passive experience.
Yeah.
Where they'll absorb more, of things that are on the tangents of what's going on. Whereas if they're having an interactive experience, be it a website, be it a mobile application, whatnot, they're very fixated on what their goal is.
Right.
And part of the reason why banner ads don't work, is because they're tentative to what they're trying to accomplish, and so the brain is automatically filtering out any extraneous information.
Right.
So.
Yeah, the idea of focus is really fascinating. Really, if we want to get philosophical about it, perception is reality, right? And your brain builds your perception all the time. And when you're really super focused, when you're doing something instead of just consuming something, you're focused on what you're doing. And having this stuff going on the sides or whatever, it's distracting, and because of that, your brain totally just pushes it. It can be there. You'll get no focus. And so you think about your eyes being a lens mechanism or whatever, and that's not really what builds focus anyway. Your eyes are incredibly inaccurate. It puts off this crazy scattershot image, and then your brain interprets it into a concise image, right? That's why that 50 millisecond UPS thingy works, right? Because your brain is collecting a crazy ton of information and then deciding what's important and kind of making up the details, which is weird to think about. None of you could look like this. Yeah, we've all heard the pop culture, the image actually comes into your brain upside down and all that stuff. Yeah, of course, it doesn't matter. Your brain turns right side up. Yeah, hits your retinas upside down. So yeah, that's just crazy to think that you're taking in so much more information, and then your brain is deciding what's important and just resolving that.
It's crazy when you think about it. I was watching this thing about people, faces.
Yeah.
Some people can't recognize faces.
Yep.
And all faces are the same. There's two eyes, there's a nose, and there's a mouth. But we can distinguish people up to, I think we have a catalog of 400 or 500 that we can keep readily available kind of thing. But just that we can pick out those minute little features.
Yeah. Well, really what it comes down to is that paying attention to only the thing that makes them different, right? So if you have, it's why you can distinguish identical twins, right? They're identical, except they may have a slightly different mannerism, or they may carry their weight differently, or whatever. And your brain only, I used to date an identical twin, so I know this firsthand, but you can tell from 100 yards which one of them it is, because they walk differently, and you don't consciously know it. It's just, yeah, or you're in trouble. Yeah, that's the crazy thing, is that really your brain only pays attention to the thing that makes them different.
I also read that there's a blind spot in your eye, and there's some things that you look at a certain distance. I forget what the distance is, but it's always making up the details at a certain
Yes.
point. So we're always making things up, and we don't even know about it.
Oh, we're always making stuff up all the time. There is a total blind spot where you're just making an assumption, but you're doing it all the time, all the time. Making crazy.
The same way, so it's hard to detect early because your brain just
Yeah, it compensates. Yeah. I'm trying to think of other books. So Blink is good. How We Decide is good. There's a book out there called Proust Was a Neuroscientist that I will save you all the time of reading right now. It's a fine book. And Jonah Lehrer, the guy who wrote it, it's the same guy that wrote How We Decide. He's a fine author. He's not a scientist. He's a journalist like Malcolm Gladwell, and he kind of synthesizes other people's stuff. But the whole point of that research, and the reason I bring it up is because it gave me a lot of, like I said, I'm not a scientist, and before I read this book, I was feeling like, I shouldn't talk about this stuff, because no matter how much I read and care about this stuff and assimilate it into my design work, I'm not a scientist. So the whole point of the book is that artists throughout time have had these crazy accurate insights into the way our brains work without really knowing, without being able to prove it, right? And only recently have we started to be able to prove that that any of this stuff works the way that any of these artists did. So the namesake of the book, Proust wrote this poem where he talked about how when he stops looking at this cookie, it goes away, right? It's a very existentialist poem. And years and years and years later, there's an fMRI study, and we figure out that, oh, yeah, like, in terms of your brain, like, you recreate this thing every time you see it. It's not like it's a static thing that exists and you don't, track it. The most interesting chapter for you and I as designers, there's a whole chapter on Cezanne and how he had this idea, and it's the reason that his paintings are the way they are, that our brain absorbs all this crazy light information and then builds resolution, and that's how he painted. And he talked about it pretty publicly. He's like, this is how I think vision works. And all the scientists of the day said, you have been drinking too much absinthe. But it turns out he was totally right. So yeah, feel free to assert your crazy ideas about how the brain works. Because, I mean, the reality is the scientists will probably be proven wrong in 50 years anyway. So,
Another great book is About Face.
I've never read that one, or never heard of it.
It's a company that would test ads for corporations,
Mhm.
and they would do all kinds of different things. One of the things they did was facial recognition. So they would like present a video ad, and they wouldn't ask the people how they felt about it. They would use facial recognition to determine how they reacted to the ad. And so he went through in the book and talked about all the things that were positive, like the best ways to go about doing things.
That's actually really cool, and it's one of the things that I know I make clients
Visual tracking.
furious with, is that I hate focus groups. I do not think that they are a valid way of getting data. I think you just make market tests. So there's this really weird effect where, like, if you ask people to rationalize their decision or to explain it to you even a little bit, they will make a decision that is against what they actually feel would be the right decision because they can rationalize it. So there's a study done in the 70s where they took two groups of college students and they brought them in, a group at a time to this room full of posters. There was two stacks of posters. One was a Monet, and the other one was of a kitty hanging on a branch, right? That hang in there, right? It's that one. And they took the first group and said, come on in, take a poster. On the way out, you have to tell the attendant why you picked which one you picked. So that group overwhelmingly, like 70%, took the kitty poster. And on the way out, they said, well, I like cats. And they left, right? The second group, they just said, all right, everybody, come on in, pick whichever poster you like and leave. End of experiment. That group overwhelmingly took the Monet. Then 6 months later, they called everybody on the telephone and asked them how they liked their posters. And the people who took the kitty posters overwhelmingly had thrown them away. And the people who took the Monet posters overwhelmingly were still happy with them. And so I don't know what their experimental, workings were, how they judged how this is what happened. But their theory was that because you had to explain what you chose, people chose what they could explain instead of taking what they wanted. So yeah, focus groups. They ask people what they think, and they'll tell you whatever they can think of to say. Whereas if you do market tests, people will make whatever choice. And there was a really interesting book that was one of the first ones that I read when I was starting to learn about this stuff called Neuromarketing by a guy named Marty Lindstrom, where they did kind of similar stuff, but they made people wear fMRI helmets while they were doing it so they could see like the blood flow to different parts of their brains while they were doing it. And he's got a new book out that I haven't read called Brand Washed. Did anybody see the David Duchovny, Demi Moore movie, the Joneses, where they played a couple who were paid to use products, like to live in a neighborhood and use products and that kind of stuff. Okay, so this guy did that for real and filmed it. And then played out the whole thing at the end of the movie where they told people, we've been living here for 90 days and we've been paid to use these products, and people really did melt down like they did in the movie. So, yeah, fascinating book. I've seen a bunch of stuff on it, but I haven't read it myself yet. Yeah.
Who composed the first book that you recommended, Creating Brain?
The Creating Brain? Oh, I could tell you later. I have it on my phone. I don't know off the top of my head.
A couple other things they talked about in that book was they used the visual tracking where they would track the pupils.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he mentioned was that the logo in the bottom right-hand corner that is so standard.
Yeah, and like print ads.
The absolute worst place to put a logo if you actually want somebody to see it because of the way you track the page.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean that's actually a great thing to talk about. It's like we are in a Western society, so we read top left to bottom, to bottom right. There's a really crazy study they did a few years ago where they did website layouts, and they figured out that like if you put the navigation on the left, on the top left, people will navigate before they read. If you put the navigation on the, on the other side, they will read before they navigate. So depending on what kind of site you want to build, if you're building a blog, put your content on the left and your navigation on the right, and people will read the entries and then navigate. If you're building Amazon.com and you don't really care that much what's on your homepage because it's the page you have to host navigation and maybe put some Kindle ads on or whatever, put your navigation in the upper left-hand corner because people will go there and find what they're looking for before they actually bother reading the giant mess that you've put on your homepage because Amazon has always had the worst homepage. Yeah, so I mean, thinking in terms of cultural context and how we use that stuff, that's how you apply this stuff as a designer, is you think about what are these mechanisms that are coming into play and how do I, if we're going to, well, I say exploit, I know that carries a negative connotation, but that is what you're doing. You're using your knowledge about these mechanisms to accomplish a goal, and that's what we're doing as designers. We create art or whatever with a goal in mind, instead of, creating it because we feel like it, or, or a client's goal, or, you know what I'm saying. Yeah, any other questions?
On that, kind of like a creative brainstorming phase that, like I find myself drawing something out, and then I'll be like, okay, I have a good idea, and I'll immediately go to the computer and try to illustrate it, but then get bogged down in just the complexities of doing that.
Yeah.
Right? So what are some of the tools that you might use that help you to actually flush an idea out?
Talk. This is actually something that we've been playing with at XCube Labs, and thankfully Jimmy is very patient to me walking into his office and talking at him. The part of your brain that creates spontaneous speech, that can talk without reading it off of a teleprompter or whatever, that same part of your brain does a lot of creation. It does most of it, right? So the thing I realized about myself is that I will have better ideas if I talk to someone about them, and then I, read a bunch of stuff and I realized why. It's because that's where all of it comes from. So I talk. That's what collaborating, that's what whiteboarding, that's what all that stuff is about. That's why, to a degree, that's why sketching works rather than what we're doing with software, is because it's like this, it's a process you have ingrained, that it's part of your thing, and you don't have to think about how to conduct, you don't have to think very hard about how to conduct a pencil. There's nothing there to take away from that process. But yeah, talking is the big one for me. If I can talk through a problem with someone, I can solve it 10 times faster. Especially if they're like great collaborators and they like have good improv skills. Yeah, it's one of the the principles of improv too is yes and. Has anybody read Truth in Comedy or the Del Close book? So the idea is like you never say no. It's always you build on what's being presented. So I could talk a whole bunch about that some other time, but yeah. Does anybody else have any questions?
That author was Nancy Andreessen.
There you go. Thank you.